The first spike of pain split Lyria's skull the moment the auctioneer's hand closed around her arm. She bit down on her tongue so hard she tasted blood, copper, and salt pooling under it. The vision clawed its way behind her eyes, white fire blooming in the dark. But she did not move. Not when they dragged her up the steps. Not when the cold wind hit her bare arms. Not when the chain at her throat clinked like a bell announcing her worth. Worthless, the last village had said. Cursed, the handlers had called her. On the block, beneath a sky the colour of old iron, she lifted her head. The vision roared. She saw teeth at someone's throat, a flash of silver, snow blackened with something that was not snow at all. A wolf's eyes, pale and merciless, turned straight toward her. Then the image snapped, leaving her breathless and blind. Do not fall. Do not scream. If they knew she was seeing, they would slit her throat then and there, and save themselves the trouble of selling her. The crowd below blurred and bled at the edges as her sight stuttered back. Dark furs, coarse wool, the sharp stink of unwashed bodies and wet leather, of snow melting on boots, the scent of wolves under everything else, wild, cold, metallic. Growls threaded through the murmur of voices, some two-legged, some not. Next one, the auctioneer barked, yanking her forward so hard her knees buckled. Lyria caught herself on shaking legs. The chain at her neck tightened, biting into her skin. She gazed somewhere past the mass of faces, fixing on the horizon where the grey sky met grey mountains, and there was nothing sharp enough to cut her open. Lot 37, the auctioneer's voice boomed, slick with derision. Seer, female, omega, fragile, but... He shook her wrist, spinning her to show the two thin lines of her. Useful enough. Comes with her own warnings, mind you. Visions, fits, curses, you know the sort. Laughter rolled up like smoke. A seer, someone called? Those things still live? Thought the last of them were burned out in the south. Look at her. She'd snap in half if you breathed on her. Cursed, more like. No pack will take that omen. Their words slid over her like knives that had already cut too many times to draw new blood. Lyria stood still. Her bare feet burned with cold against the stained wood. The iron collar burned hotter. Another pulse of pain lanced behind her eyes. Not now, not now. She forced her hands to stay limp at her sides, nails digging into her own palms where the crowd couldn't see. If you move, you die. They had told her that in the cages, the handlers who spoke to her like one speaks to an animal that hasn't yet learned the beatings it will earn. Seers who showed visions at auction were bad omens. Bad omens did not sell. Bad omens got their throats opened behind the pens. She smells wrong, a woman in the crowd said, wrinkling her nose, like storm fire. Like death, like trouble. Another man spat at the planks near Lyria's feet. Who wants that brought into their den? Useless omega. Won't breed strong pups, won't fight, won't hunt. Her kind brings ruin. They were not entirely wrong. Wherever she went, something did break. She could feel the auctioneer's impatience in the way his fingers dug into her thin arm. Lyria swayed as the remnants of the vision crackled through her nerves, leaving them raw and hollow. She had not eaten since yesterday, and even then it had been scraps. Her stomach pinched and twisted in on itself. Her limbs felt like someone else's. "Opening bid," the auctioneer shouted. 10 silver. Silence met him. Lyria heard the wind pass through the square like a drawn breath. Somewhere a wolf barked once, sharp and derisive. Snowflakes began to drift from the iron sky, slow and delicate, at odds with the weight pressing on her chest. 10 silver, the auctioneer repeated, louder. For a seer. Think on that, folks. Prophet's blood. Useful in war if you've the spine for it. Useful in getting your pack slaughtered more like, someone muttered. A ripple of grim agreement. 5 silver, a voice called lazily from the back. For the entertainment. She can twitch and speak nonsense in the kitchen. My pups will laugh. Laughter spat up again, ugly and bright. 5, the auctioneer snapped. She's worth less than the rope around her neck. Another blossom of pain flared behind Lyria's eyes. For a heartbeat, she saw the square differently. Saw the wooden platform cracked open and black blood flowing out. Saw wolves tearing at something at her feet. Saw a shadow, tall and cold as winter, looming at the edge of the crowd. Her breath hitched, her fingers curled tighter, nails piercing her own skin. Enough! The word did not come from the auctioneer. It cut through the mockery like a blade, low and flat and threaded with authority that made the boards under Lyria's feet tremble. The crowd hushed, heads turned toward the open path that formed the press of bodies, people stumbling back as if pushed by an invisible hand. Wolves in half-shifted forms lowered themselves, ears flattening, tails dropping as they parted to make way. He walked through them like their fear meant nothing. Lyria saw him first as a collection of fragments, black cloak edged in frost, boots dark with old mud, the silver clasp at his shoulder shaped like a wolf's head. The air around him seemed colder, the snow falling harder, each flake catching in the dark of his hair. His scent hit her a moment before the shape of him did. Winter, steel, the feral edge of a predator, so used to blood that it clung to him even when he was clean. The Alpha King, someone whispered. Ronan. Her vision tried to rise again, drawn to him like wildfire to dry timber. A flash, his hands red to the wrists, a circle of bodies on snow, a young boy's eyes glassy, and gone. The same silver wolf clasp, but untarnished. She forced the images down with a bite to her tongue and focused on breathing. In, out. Do not let it show. Ronan stopped at the foot of the platform, not bothered by the whipping wind or the specks of snow melting onto his shoulders. His gaze lifted, dark and glacial, and pinned her where she stood. Lyria had never seen eyes like that. Wolves' eyes were often bright, gold, amber, ice blue. His were the color of a storm ocean, dark and depthless, ringed with a pale chill that did not soften when he looked at her. He was not an old man, younger than the tales had made him in her mind. But there was a weight in the set of his jaw, in the faint scar that crossed from the corner of his brow to his temple, that spoke of things weathered, endured, survived at a cost. Your Majesty, the auctioneer stammered, his voice all oil suddenly. His hand dropped from Lyria's arm. We weren't expecting. She's the only seer, Ronan said, as if that explained his presence. His voice was low, unhurried, edged with something that might once have been warmth and had frozen into something else. The rest of your lots are muscle and wombs. The auctioneer flinched, chuckled weakly. I, my king, and I'm sure you've no time for a cursed. How much? Ronan said. The square was so quiet, Lyria could hear the wind scraping along the eaves of the nearby roofs. Her heartbeat pounded slow and heavy against her ribs, each thud echoing in the empty places inside her. The auctioneer licked his lips. For her? She's, well, Seers aren't exactly... A pause. Calculations flickered in his bloodshot eyes. 10 silver, he said finally, hope hesitant. Opening bid. 50, Ronan said. The word fell like a stone into a frozen lake. Lyria felt the shock ripple through the crowd, even before the murmurs exploded. 50? Has he lost his mind? For her? She'll doom us all. 50 silver could buy 3 healthy fighters, a breeding pair of strong-blooded wolves, a small house in a decent village. Lyria knew that without ever having owned more than the clothes on her back. The auctioneer gaped. 50, Your Majesty? You must... Ronan's head turned slightly. His gaze brushed across the man, cold and dismissive as a knife's back. Do you want it in coin or blood, cast? The auctioneer's mouth snapped shut. Silence again. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. 50 is more than generous, my king, Cast stammered. Of course, she's yours. Lyria's knees nearly went from under her. Hers. No, his. The chain at her neck was thrust into another's hand. One of Ronan's men, broad-shouldered, with a scar through his lip and eyes that did not bother to look at her face. Move, he growled under his breath. She stumbled off the platform, careful not to clutch her head, as another dull wave of pain rolled through it. The world swam around the edges. She smelled snow, iron, the steady, grounding presence of wolf scent all around her, and his, sharper, closer than she wanted it to be. As she came level with him, Ronan shifted slightly, enough that she had to pass within arm's reach. He did not touch her, did not glance at her again, but she felt the weight of his decision like a collar, heavier than iron. He hates Seers, her memory whispered. Every tale she had heard from traders and caravan guards spoke of it. The Alpha King who outlawed prophecy, who burned shrines, who hanged a priest on his own prayer cords. A false prophecy had ruined him, the stories said, took his pack, his kin, his heart, and yet he had just bought one. 50 silver. Not kindness, Lyria thought as the chain tugged her forward, feet slipping on the icy ground. Never kindness. Not from a man whose eyes looked like the sky before a storm breaks. They reached the edge of the square. Behind them, the hushed murmur grew into a roar of speculation, anger, fear. Ahead, beyond the crooked houses, the dark line of the forest pressed close, and somewhere beyond that, she knew, rose the black stoned fortress that held his name. Her stomach twisted. The vision burned at its edges, wanting to spill, to show her more, to show her wolves at gates, fires in snow. That same shadowed figure, him, standing over something broken. She locked her jaw. You are already too much of an omen. Do not be more. Ronan stepped past her to mount his horse, the great grey beast pawing at the frozen mud. He swung into the saddle with easy grace, cloak flaring briefly, then settling like a piece of night around him. He finally looked at her again, just once, and whatever he saw there did not change his face. Take her to the fortress, he told his man, voice flat. She is not to be touched. She is not to be believed. Not to be believed. A cold worse than the wind slid under her skin. He buys a seer he refuses to trust, buys a cursed thing he will not let anyone else break. Possession, not mercy. The chain jerked. The soldier started forward, dragging her along beside the king's horse as they turned away from the square. Snow fell harder now, the flakes clinging to Lyria's lashes, wet and cold and blurring everything into grey. She stumbled, caught herself, glanced up once more at the man who had just paid a small fortune for her life. He did not look back. Fear surged up, thick and choking. It pressed against the question already forming, like a bruise in her chest, the one her mouth dared to shape, even though no one would answer her. Her voice came out hoarse, barely louder than the wind, as the fortress road opened before them. Why did he choose me? The fortress swallowed sound. Cold stone rose on all sides, its walls slick with old frost, its towers knifing into the grey sky. As Lyria crossed beneath the iron-wrought gate, the air changed, thinner, sharper, layered with scents that made her skin prickle. Wolf, blood, smoke, steel. Fear threaded through her veins, hot against the winter chill. She tried to breathe shallow, tried to hide it, but the warriors waiting in the courtyard lifted their heads as one, nostrils flaring. They scented it like hounds scenting a wound. The chain at her throat jerked her forward into the open space. Snow had been beaten into slush by countless boots. Training dummies stood broken-backed at the edges. A rack of weapons gleamed dully along one wall. Wolves in partial shift padded between men, ears pricked, eyes bright, shoulders rolling with quiet threat. New meat, someone said, voice thick with amusement. Not meat. Another sniffed the air more deliberately, lip curling. Rot. Lyria kept her gaze low, watching the ground instead of the ring of bodies tightening around her. Every step sent a thin shard of pain up from the soles of her bare feet, up her shins, into knees that wanted to buckle. Her head still throbbed from the vision at the auction. It hadn't fully left her, just pulled back like a wave waiting for the shore to forget it. Hold, Ronan's man muttered, tightening his grip on the chain as the circle of warriors closed in. They were larger up close than they had seemed from the auction platform. Broad shoulders under thick furs, muscles running like braided rope beneath their skin. Scars crossed throats, jaws, bare forearms. Some eyes glowed faintly with the shimmer of the wolf beneath the surface. These were men who considered pain an old friend. Ronan rode past them without slowing, his horse's breath clouding in the air. He gave no order, no warning. The crowd parted for him without thought, their eyes tracking him even as their attention clung to her like teeth. Is that a seer? In our walls? She'll curse the whole damn fortress. Her name was lost under the word. Seer. Cursed. Omega. Her own name, Lyria, felt like something fragile she carried in her chest, a thing she did not dare set down anywhere in this place. Where do you want the witch, Crocs? The soldier at her chain called out. The answer came from the far side of the yard, where a man watched with arms folded over his chest. He was tall, even among these giants, his dark hair tied back at the nape of his neck. A thin scar cleaved his lower lip, giving his resting face a permanent sneer. His cloak was fastened not with Ronan's silver wolf, but with iron, duller, heavier. War general, Lyria guessed. The way he stood, the way attention bent toward him even when he said nothing. Far from the barracks, he said. His voice was like gravel ground under boot. We don't keep sickness with the strong. Laughter rolled through the warriors, cruel and easy. Crux started toward her. As he walked, wolves slunk out of his path, tails flicking low. His gaze dragged over her. Thin limbs, bruised wrists, the too loose collar hanging around her fragile throat, as if cataloguing each weakness and finding not one worth respecting. He stopped a pace away. Up close, Lyria could see the wolf in him more clearly. It lived in the hard angles of his face, in the way his eyes shifted, just faintly, catching light like an animal's. His scent was smoke and old blood, and something else, the sharp tang of iron discipline, loyalty, honed to a blade's edge. She smells of visions, he said quietly, like an accusation, of rot and lies. Lyria forced herself not to flinch. She doesn't speak, Ronan's man cut in roughly. King's orders? Ronan hadn't actually said that. But the way Crux's head tilted, the faint narrowing of his eyes, made it clear the lie served him anyway. She doesn't speak unless spoken to, Crux corrected softly, and not by anyone but the king, until he remembers what her kind cost him and has her head on a spike. The words lodged under her ribs, sharp and cold. Around them the warriors murmured, low and hungry. Should have left her at the block. Better yet, at the pyres. She'll weaken us. You watch. Lyria's skull pulsed once, hard. Something flickered at the edges of her vision. Shapes moving quick and violent against the fortress walls. A spray of red across stone. For an instant, she saw wolves tumbling in snow, one knot rising. She shut it down with a breath so deep it hurt. Do not see. Not here. Not in front of them. Crux stepped even closer until she could see the tiny flecks of silver at the center of his dark irises. He leaned in, inhaling as if to commit her scent to memory. If I smell you near our training grounds, he murmured, so low only she and the man at her chain could hear. I will take it as a sign the gods desire your blood, and I am devout. The threat was smooth, almost bored. It made her skin crawl more than shouted rage would have. He straightened. Put her in the old storeroom beneath the east tower, he said loudly. No window, one blanket. She doesn't need more. She needs food, someone muttered. Crux's gaze snapped toward the speaker. The warrior, a younger man with hair braided on one side, ducked his head immediately, throat bared in reflex. Strength is fed by hunger, Crux said. The weak either harden, his eyes slid back to Lyria, or rot away. Either outcome serves this pack. The chain jerked. Lyria was dragged across the yard, past warriors who snorted and turned away, or watched her with thin, assessing disdain. One woman, her knuckles split and bleeding from recent practice, spat in the snow at Lyria's passing. Bad omen, she said. We've bled enough for profits. Inside the fortress, corridors were worse than the cold. They smelled like old battles, iron and sweat soaked into stone. Torches guttered along the walls, their light wavering over carved reliefs of wolves locked in perpetual war. Her thin dress clung damply to her skin. Every draught found its way through. The storeroom under the east tower was little more than a cell. No window, just a low ceiling, stone walls that sweated cold, and a pile of old sacks shoved into one corner. The soldier unclipped the chain from the ring in her collar and looped it instead through an iron ring bolted to the floor. He did not look at her as he left. The door shut with a heavy clank. The lock turned. For a time, Lyria just knelt there, listening to her own heartbeat echo in the dim. Suffering is strength, she thought weakly, remembering Crux's voice, the way the warriors wore their scars like jewelry. Pain was something they chose, a thing they wrestled and made part of their pride. Hers chose her, broke her from the inside. That difference would damn her here. A vision tried to rise hours later, dragging her from a thin, cold doze. Sharp pain speared her skull, bright enough to blind. She pressed her forehead into the stone, biting back a cry as images flared. Flashes of the training yard, bodies colliding, a throat snapping back at an unnatural angle. She swallowed the scream, Stone tasted of dust and salt against her lips. Blood warmed the back of her throat, where she had bitten through her own tongue again. They will hear. They will know. They will kill you. When the pain faded to a dull pounding, she uncurled slowly. Her limbs shook. Her breath came in small, careful sips. Above her, muted through stone, she could hear the distant thud of boots, the bark of commands. The pack moving, training, living as if a seer had not just been dragged into their midst and chained like a dangerous animal. Time blurred. Hunger gnawed at her belly. Eventually, the door scraped open. "Move!" the same soldier growled, voice flat with disinterest. The chain tugged. Lyria pushed herself to her feet and followed him through the corridors, up into a wider hall where tapestries hung heavy, with embroidered battles. She caught a glimpse through an arrow-slit window, the training yard below, grey and white and red-brown, where old blood stained the snow. They didn't take her to the king. They took her to the edge of the yard. "Here," she whispered, before she could stop herself. "Crux wants you to see," the man said. "Said you should know what strength looks like before you start infecting it." He snapped the chain to another ring set into the wall. Not much slack, enough to stand, to move a few paces, not enough to run. Warriors were already in the yard, paired off, bare-armed despite the cold. Breath steamed in the air. Blows landed with the thick, meaty sound of flesh meeting flesh. A few wolves paced at the edges, watching with keen eyes. Lyria's gaze snagged on one. Figure. Young, maybe 16. Too lean for his height. His stance was slightly off, weight too far forward. His eyes flicked, just once, in her direction before hardening. Crux stalked between the pairs like a shadow, correcting stances with sharp slaps to shoulders, barking terse commands. Again, harder. If you can still breathe, you're not done. A fighter went down, clutching his ribs. He tried to push up, failed once, then twice. Crux nudged him with his boot, not gently. "On your feet, pup." "I think," the man wheezed. "I think something broke." "Good," Crux said. "Now you learn where bones give way." He walked on. No one moved to help the fallen man. After a moment, gritting his teeth, the warrior forced himself up, one arm clamped tight to his side. He staggered back into position. Lyria's fingers curled against the cold iron at her wrists. Everything in her ached to cross the yard, to lay hands on the bruised ribs and breathe relief into them. The way she had for frightened children, for injured farmers in the villages that had tolerated her long enough to use her, before they turned on her when her visions proved too true. Here, that instinct was treason against their way of life. Seers bring weakness, she had heard again and again. Comfort where there should be courage, fear where there should be faith in the fang. The yard filled with the dull, repetitive brutality of training. Men fell and rose, blood flecked the snow. No one cried out beyond a grunt or curse. Pain was swallowed, made private, turned into something like worship. When a particularly vicious exchange sent the young recruit she'd noticed crashing to the ground, the breath punched from his lungs in a harsh, aborted sound, Lyria flinched. He stayed down longer than the others had. Too long. Crux turned, scenting it. He started toward the boy. Without thinking, Lyria moved. The chain snapped taut, jerking her back with a bite of iron. The sound of it scraped across the yard. Heads turned. The boy's gaze flicked to her again. Eyes wide for a heartbeat, then narrowing into something like disdain. "Stay where you are, witch," Someone snarled. She swallowed, throat tight. He can't! He can! Crox's voice cut across hers. He'd stopped beside the boy, but he didn't look at Lyria yet. If he can't, he dies. That's how the weak serve us. Lyria's skull throbbed. A ghost of the earlier vision slid behind her eyes. The same boy, but with his head at a wrong angle. Limbs splayed in snow that would not soak the blood fast enough. Her fingers dug into the iron ring, knuckles white. The urge to help rose in her like a tide. With it came the pain, sharp and bright, telling her that if she reached out, the vision would break open, dragging her down. She bit her tongue until she tasted copper again. The boy coughed, rolled onto his side, dragged himself to his knees with a sound that was more snarl than groan. Crux smiled, just a little. There, see? Strength, not your kind of poison. He turned his head then, slowly, to look at her. You so eager to touch our wounded Seer? He called, voice caring. Looking to spread your filth? You think your hands heal? All they do is mark who will die. The warriors laughed. Some of them looked uneasy, though. Their eyes slid away from her quickly, as if afraid that meeting her gaze would invite a prophecy they did not want. Heat crawled up Lyria's neck, into her face. Did I ask you a question? Crox's tone dropped, soft and deadly. Her mouth snapped shut. Good, he said. Then remember, you do nothing unless commanded. If you so much as flinch toward one of my men, I'll... The words cut off, not because he was done, but because the yard had shifted. The air itself seemed to cool by a degree. The warriors' spines straightened. Ronan had arrived. He stood at the far edge of the yard, cloak dark against the pale stone, hands bare despite the cold. He had come without fanfare. Somehow the pack always knew when he was near anyway. His gaze swept the yard, taking in the pairs, the blood, the rhythm of training, and then landed on Lyria. It was like being pinned to the wall by a spear of ice. Her heart staggered against her ribs. The iron ring dug into her palms. Behind her eyes, the vision trembled, wanting to spill. This yard, these men, the moment tipping towards something that could not be mended without her moving, without her breaking every rule already pressing on her throat. In the snow at the center of the yard, another pair clashed, too wild, too hard. A misstep, a shove, a twist. Lyria saw it a heartbeat before it happened. A foot sliding on slush, a neck exposed, a body falling wrong. The crack of bones snapped through the air. The warrior hit the ground and did not move. Silence. Even the wind seemed to stop. Lyria's breath caught. Her fingers flew to her temple as a spike of vision tore through her. This man on a pyre, this man's mate ripping at her own hair in grief. Wolves howling at a sky that did not care. Pain blinded her for a moment. When it cleared, the warrior was still on the ground, his chest barely rising, his head at that awful, unnatural angle. The yard held its breath, waiting to see if he would rise. Lyria trembled on the edge of a choice that felt like a cliff. Stay silent. Let their brutal gods have him, or reach for him and reveal what she was capable of. She lifted a hand a fraction, the beginning of a step forward, and felt more than saw. Ronan's gaze sharpened on her from across the yard, cold and unreadable as winter itself. Blood steamed in the snow where she knelt. The young warrior's breath rattled, thin and wet. Each exhale a cloud that barely formed before it broke apart. His head lolled at that wrong angle, eyes fluttering with a glassy, distant look that Lyria had seen before. On battlefields, in plague houses, in the faces of those already half out of their bodies. Ronan's order pressed against the back of her skull like iron. She is not to be touched. She is not to be believed. Her knees were already damp and numb from the cold. The ring and chain that held her bit into her spine as she leaned forward, drawn by the sound of the boy's breathing. Around them, the yard held itself tight, as if the stones watched too. "Leave him," Crux said behind her. "If he's meant to rise, he will. If not..." The boy's breath caught. Didn't come back for a heartbeat too long. Lyria's body moved before her fear could stop it. Her hands closed over his shoulders, fingers sinking into the heat of his skin through torn leather, and the vision exploded. White pain split her skull. The world vanished. She saw his spine like a twisted branch. One vertebra cracked, another slipped. She saw threads of bone, sinew, blood, all glowing faintly, as if someone had drawn the lines of him with light and then broken them. She saw the path his life would take if she did nothing. Breath slowing, nerve endings going quiet. His mother collapsing over the pyre. Crux turning away without a word because weakness did not deserve mourning. No. The denial wasn't a word so much as a raw, internal flare. Her fingers tightened. Warmth surged from somewhere deep inside her, from the place where her own visions left bruises. It poured through her hands, burning, aching, a different kind of pain. The boy arched with a strangled sound. Bones grated. Something inside him shifted. "Get off him!" Crux's roar tore across the yard. "Which?" Her head throbbed with pressure, like her skull might crack open and spill light. She held on, jaw locked, breath sawing. The warmth seared along the broken lines she'd seen, forcing them back into place. Every inch she mended cost her flesh, as if the injury were being pulled through her body and burned there instead. The boy gasped, a sharp, shocked inhale that sounded like drowning in reverse. Hands clamped around Lyria's shoulders, ripping her backward. The connection snapped, the warmth cut off, leaving a hollow that made her stomach lurch. The world lurched with it. Torches, snow, wolves, all swinging wildly for a heartbeat before settling. She hit the ground on her hip hard enough to jar her teeth. The chain at her throat rang. The boy on the ground choked, rolled onto his side, and coughed. His neck, when he lifted his head, was straight. He wheezed, blinked up at the sky as if expecting to see the afterlife, and finding only grey clouds. A stunned murmur rippled through the watching pack. Crux's hand was still fisted in Lyria's dress. Rage shook through him like a living thing. His wolf rode high in his eyes, bright and wild, teeth almost visible in the tension of his jaw. "You filthy..." "Enough!" Ronan's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The grip on her loosened at once. Every instinct in Crux, answering the alpha, even when his fury didn't. He let go of her slowly, fingers uncurled, like he was unclenching them from her throat in his mind. "She touched him in front of the entire yard," Crux said, breathing hard. "She poisoned his fate. Who knows what she's twisted? She kept him alive." Ronan's gaze cut to the boy, who was pushing himself shakily to his knees. "That is the only fact I see." Lyria swayed where she sat. The world felt wrong in her skin, like she'd put on a body that didn't fit quite right. Pain pulsed in waves from her hands up her arms, dull and throbbing now that the sharpness had passed. The boy's eyes flicked to her, fear tangled with something like awe, then shuttered quickly as he ducked his head. No one wanted to be seen respecting a seer. "Let him stand," Ronan said. 2 warriors helped the boy up. He wobbled but stayed upright, one hand touching the back of his neck in disbelief. Crux shook his head, disgust carving harsh lines into his face. "You are letting corruption root here, my king. When prophecy last walked among us, we buried half the pack." Ronan's gaze slid to him, ice over steel. "When I want a history lesson, I'll ask for one." Crux's jaw worked. He bowed, stiff. "Yes, Alpha." Ronan turned away from him and looked at Lyria. For a heartbeat, everything else in the yard fell away. She felt that gaze like a weight, like a hand on the nape of her neck, forcing her still. She couldn't read his expression. Not anger, not exactly. Not approval either. Something sharper, more searching. "Bring her to my study," he said. "Now." The yard exhaled as he walked away. The fortress corridors narrowed the world to stone and breath, and the dull clink of her chain. Lyria's legs trembled as the soldier led her, but she kept her head up. The vision's afterburn still smouldered behind her eyes. She saw flashes as they walked, wolves' shadows sliding along the walls, echoes of old battles imprinted like stains only her cursed sight could catch. Ronan's study was high in the main keep, up a stair that stole what little breath she had left. When the door opened, warmth hit her first. A fire burned in a wide hearth, throwing flickering light over shelves crowded with maps and carved figures. The room smelled of smoke, ink, leather, and the same winter-sharp scent that clung to Ronan himself. He stood with his back to her, hands braced on a table where a map lay spread and pinned at the corners with knives. "Leave us," he said without turning. The soldier unclipped her chain from his fist, leaving the collar's weight around her neck. The door shut behind him with a soft thud. Silence. Only the crackle of fire and the faint rasp of Ronan's breath. Lyria stood just inside the threshold, unsure if she was meant to speak, to kneel, to do nothing. The floor beneath her bare feet was smooth stone, warmed unevenly by the hearth. Her hands still burned, invisible bruises under the skin. "You defied a direct order," Ronan said at last. His voice was even, but there was something tired in it, as if his anger cost more than he wanted to pay. He straightened and turned. In this light, he looked less like a legend and more like a man who had not slept properly in years. Shadows sat under his eyes, his hair, dark and too long at the back, curled slightly with the heat. The scar at his temple stood out pale against his skin. "He was dying," Lyria said quietly. The words surprised her. They sounded steadier than she felt. Ronan's gaze flicked to her hands. "And now, he is not." She followed his eyes, saw the faint redness along her own fingers. Her palms ached, the ghost of the boy's injury echoing through them. "You can heal," he said. It wasn't a question. Still, she nodded. "Sometimes, if it's close, if I see the break, it never comes without the vision." "How many have you done that for?" She swallowed. Faces flashed behind her eyes. Children fevered and cooling, old men who still died days later, women whose broken bones knit crooked because she had found them too late. "Enough to know it hurts," she said. "More for me than for them." His jaw flexed. A muscle ticked there like something restrained. He stepped closer. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that the hearth's glow caught the darker flecks in his eyes, close enough that she could feel the quiet heat of his body under the cold of his scent. The room seemed to narrow again, this time to him, to the steady, contained power he carried, like another layer of skin. You understand what your disobedience does, he said. Crux will see it as rot spreading. The old laws were written in blood. Seers bring ruin. That belief is baked into their bones. You make it harder for me to keep you alive. You bought me, Lyria said, for 50 silver. It slipped out before she could stop it. A question threaded through the statement, raw and small. Why? His eyes sharpened. The alpha in him didn't like being questioned. She felt it in the way his attention tightened, like a wolf adjusting its stance. 50 silver was cheaper than watching you die on that platform and wondering if I had ignored something useful, he said. I don't believe in omens, Seer. I believe in information, tools, weapons. You are one of those until you prove too dangerous to hold. The words should have chilled her. They did. But under the cold, something else flickered. A twisted kind of honesty she had not expected. You hate us, she said softly. Seers? His mouth thinned. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, I hate what Trusting One did to my people. The room shifted. The fire popped, throwing sparks that died before they could reach them. Lyria's pulse stumbled. What happened? He looked past her, toward the narrow window slit that showed only a slice of white sky. When he spoke, his voice had changed, lower, rougher, the edges scraped by something old. We were not always like this, he said. This fortress, these laws. Once my pack believed in the old ways, in prophecy, the moon's chosen. We had a seer of our own, not like you. There it was, the reflexive contempt. It softened the word without taking its bite away. She said the spirits had shown her a path, he went on, a valley where our enemies would be vulnerable, a night when their guards would sleep, a sign in the sky that would tell us when to strike. He paused. His hand had curled into a fist on the table. We trusted her. I trusted her. I led them into that valley. We waited for the sign. His jaw worked, as if the memory tasted foul. It came, we attacked, but the spirits she listened to did not speak of the second army waiting in the ravine behind us. Lyria's chest tightened. She could see it as he spoke. Wolves pouring into a trap. Their confidence turned into their noose. How many? She asked, barely more than a breath. Ronan's eyes came back to hers. They were bleak now, that storm ocean going flat. Half, he said. Half the pack died there. My father, my brother. The seer who saw it all burned herself before dawn, rather than face what she'd done. The rest learned a different lesson about faith. The silence that followed was heavy, but not empty. It hummed with ghosts. Lyria's own breath shook in her chest. The pain she carried for strangers was one kind. This was another, one she recognized in the way he held himself, as if any slackness would let the grief tear through. I'm sorry, she said. The words were simple, small, but they were the only ones that didn't feel like a lie. His mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, not quite a sneer. Sorry doesn't put bones back in the ground. No, she agreed, but I know what it is to see something awful and not be able to stop it. To wake with dust in your mouth from someone else's grave. To wish your visions were wrong. He studied her, head tilted slightly. You think that is the same as watching your pack die because you told them it was safe to walk into a slaughter. No, she said again, and met his gaze steadily. I think both are different kinds of hell. Something in his expression flickered. The mask shifted, just enough for her to see the man under the king. the younger version of him, standing in a valley full of bodies, realizing what belief had cost. Unexpected warmth moved through his eyes, so, faint she might have imagined it, it made her breath catch, not because it promised safety, but because it suggested he'd remembered, for a heartbeat, what it was to be seen as human rather than only as alpha. He stepped back, the distance between them snapping taut again. "Do not heal without my command," he said softly. "Crux is not wrong about what my people fear. You walk a thin edge here, Lyria. One misstep, and they will tear you apart, and I will not stop them." "You stopped him today," she said. His gaze cooled. "I stopped him because I need you intact, until I understand what you are." He turned away, dismissing her with his body before his words. "You will be taken back to your cell. You'll be fed. You will rest. Tomorrow you will watch the yard again. You will not move unless I say so." Her throat tightened. "And if someone is dying again?" He hesitated. The pause was brief, but she saw it. "Then you will wait," he said, "until I decide whether their life or your secret is worth more." The door opened at his quiet call. The soldier reappeared, hand already reaching for her chain. As she was led out, Lyria looked back once. Ronan stood by the table, head bowed, fingers braced on the map. For an instant, his shoulders slumped, the weight he carried visible. Then he straightened, and the king's mask slid back into place. The cell felt smaller that night. The stone pressed closer. The air was thick with cold and the lingering sting of smoke from some distant hearth. Lyria curled on the pile of sacks, the thin blanket rough under her cheek. Her hands ached less, but a deep, bone-deep weariness had settled in. She listened to the fortress breathe. Distant steps, muffled voices, a wolf's howl far off in the snow-drowned dark. Sleep came in jerks. Every time she began to slide under, the memory of the boy's broken neck or Ronan's face in the firelight yanked her back. When the vision hit, it felt like the world was torn open. Pain slammed into her skull, harder than before. She gasped, clutching her head, as white, hot shards drove behind her eyes. The cell vanished. She saw the fortress gate, half open. Ronan's warriors pouring out into a forest thick with fog. She saw shadows moving beyond the trees, too many, too quick. Arrows blotting the sky like a swarm of black locusts. She saw Ronan at the front, cloak snapping, eyes bright with the fierce focus of battle. Behind him, the ground shifted. Not fog, not shadows, an army, twice the size they expected. Coming from the side, hidden until the last moment. Ambush. The vision twisted, plunged her forward into the thick of it. Wolves fell, howls turning to gurgles. Ronan turned, eyes widening as he realized how wrong the numbers were. A spear drove toward his heart. Lyria screamed. Her body convulsed on the cold stone. The collar dug into her throat as she arched. The taste of iron flooded her mouth where she bit her tongue. The images burned and would not let go until finally, blessedly, they began to fade, leaving her shaking. She rolled onto her side, breath tearing out of her in ragged bursts. Tears stung her eyes, hot against her chilled skin. Not again, she thought. Not another trap. Not another pack buried because someone saw too late. The chain rattled as she dragged herself closer to the door, as if proximity to the world beyond could somehow change what she'd seen. Her voice was raw when it came, more air than sound, but the words forced themselves out anyway, desperate and hoarse. "He's not safe," she whispered to the empty stone. The cell didn't answer. The fortress did not shift course. But somewhere above her, the Alpha King planned a march into the snow, and her vision clung to him like frost she could not shake. The war horns split the dawn before the sun had the courage to rise. Their low, rolling call shuddered through stone and bone alike. Lyria jerked awake on her pile of sacks, heart already racing, vision clawing for her attention like a trapped animal. Not now, she thought, but the pain didn't listen. White fire lanced through her skull. The cell dissolved. She saw the gates yawning open, breath of winter pouring in. Ronan at their head, cloak slashed black against the snow. His warriors fanning around him in a dark, disciplined wave. The forest ahead, silent, too silent. Fog clinging low to the ground like something alive. Then the angle shifted. The world tilted. From above she saw them. Shapes in the trees, boughs drawn, blades ready. Double their number, waiting, not in front. On the flanks, behind, a trap closing like jaws. Her stomach heaved. She dragged in a breath that tasted of stone and iron and panic. The vision didn't wait for her consent. It plunged her deeper, into the moment when Ronan stepped past a particular stand of pines, into the instant when the first arrow flew, black against white. Lyria slammed her head back against the wall. The shock of pain was enough to break the images apart. They scattered like startled birds, leaving only fragments. Fog, pines, Ronan's profile lit by brief, sharp fear. "He's not safe," she rasped to the empty cell again. No one answered. The horns sounded a second time. She scrambled to her knees, the chain attached to her collar, rattled furiously as she lurched toward the door. "Guard!" she called, voice cracking. "Please, someone!" Boots thudded in the corridor. The small hatch scraped open. A pair of eyes, irritated and half awake, glared in. "What?" "I need to speak to the king." The words tumbled out, wild and useless. "Please, there's a trap. The forest, there's an army." The hatch slammed shut. The footsteps retreated, swallowed by the growing roar of movement elsewhere. Armor, voices, the pack waking to war. Lyria sagged against the door, trembling. They won't listen. They never listen. She saw the valley from Ronan's story, saw blood soaking snow as men died for a prophecy that lied. The hatred that had shaped this fortress was born there. Her warning would sound like the first note of that same old song. Still, the vision gnawed at her, raw and insistent. If she did nothing, if she stayed in her cell while the trap closed. She stood. The chain at her throat gave her 3 steps worth of freedom. It would not get her through stone. But stone had cracks. It always did. She ran her fingers along the wall, palms skimming cold slickness and rough seams. The collar had a small metal ring for the chain's hook. The hook itself was simple iron, not made for strength so much as obedience. She wrapped the chain around both hands, braced her feet, and pulled. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a scraping, groan, the hook bent just slightly. Lyria's muscles burned. Her shoulders screamed. She pulled harder, breath tearing out between her teeth. The ring in the floor held, but the hook warped, opened. With one last wrench, the chain slipped free. She nearly fell backward. The collar still gripped her throat, but at least now the length of chain dragged loose behind her like a dead snake. Lyria stared at the door. "You will die out there," the practical part of her hissed. "A seer in a battlefield. Crux will gut you himself if the enemy doesn't." She shoved the thought down and threw herself at the latch. The bolt wasn't even fully set. In the rush for war, No one had remembered to lock the cursed seer. The door scraped open. Cold slammed into her first, the kind of cold that bit lungs from the inside. She stumbled into the corridor, chain clinking against stone, and followed the sound of the horns and the thunder of boots. The main hall was chaos. Warriors moved in quick, efficient lines, fastening armor, checking weapons. Wolves in half-shift snarled and paced, hackles up. No one spared her more than a glance. Most, not even that. Many were already gone, drawn out by Ronan's call. She kept to the shadows, thin as a whisper against the wall, and trailed them. At the gate, the world opened. Snow stretched in an unbroken sheet, white and blinding in the early light. Ronan sat astride his grey horse at the head of the assembled force, Crux a dark shape at his right shoulder. Breath steamed from men and beasts, rising in ghostly columns. Lyria's heart choked itself in her chest. Too late. She hugged the inner curve of the gate as the horns sounded a third time. The gates creaked wider. The army moved. Ronan didn't look back. The vision hissed at the edges of her mind, trying to drag her ahead to the ambush. Fog, pines, blood. Lyria fell into the wake of the departing warriors, keeping her head down. No one expected something small and unarmored to be following them. All eyes were on the tree line, on the distant hint of fog. Once they passed beyond the last watchful eyes on the walls, the world narrowed to crunching snow and the labored rhythm of her own breath. Her feet went numb, then burned, then numbed again. The collar chafed her skin raw. Frost clung to the ends of her hair, turning strands stiff. The forest rose ahead, black trunks spearing the sky. Fog pooled between them, low and unnatural. Her vision surged, eager. Lyria let it drag her. Images layered over reality, this path and the other one, the one where Ronan rode blind into the jaws waiting for him. She saw where the enemy lay in that not-quite future, behind that stand of pines, above that rocky outcrop, down in that hollow pretending to be merely shadow. She veered almost without realizing it, slipping between trees, keeping parallel to the main force, but not in their tracks. Her breaths came in ragged bursts. Twigs snagged at her dress. Branches slapped her face, leaving stinging welts. The horn's echo died. The army pushed deeper. The fog thickened, swallowing sound. The vision sharpened. She saw it now as if standing at Ronan's shoulder. The narrow clearing ahead, the dead quiet, the sense that something was watching. The first arrow drawing back to fly straight for his throat. Her heart lunged. She ran. The forest tilted, rearranging around her in dizzying fragments. Her body followed, what her mind saw more than what her eyes did. Turn here, duck there, avoid that patch of snow where an arrow would fall a heartbeat later. Her lungs burned, her feet slipped. She crashed into a drift, snow burning cold up her legs, then clawed out of it, driven by the knowledge that every second was another step toward the trap. The first scream tore through the fog as she broke into a run. Not a human scream, a wolf's, then chaos. Arrows hissed through the air. Something thudded into a tree near her head, showering bark on her. Men shouted. Wolves snarled. The clash of metal on metal rang out, sharp and brutal. She burst into the clearing just in time to see the world come apart. Ronan's warriors were everywhere, fighting in tight clusters, backs to each other, as enemies surged from the trees. The opposing force wore dark armor, quick and silent, their faces half covered. Arrows rained from the branches above, thudding into meat and snow with sickening, dull sounds. There, Ronan, on foot now, his horse gone, blade flashing as he cut down a man who lunged at his flank. Crux was nowhere in sight. The vision shoved hard, aligning itself with the moment unfolding. She saw the path of the next arrow before it left the string. Saw the archer high above, bow aimed not at the mass, but at the point of the spear. Ronan. Lyria didn't think. She moved. She threw herself forward, feet slipping in blood-slick snow, weaving through bodies like a ghost no one expected. A warrior swung at an enemy and nearly took her head off by accident. She ducked under his arm, feeling the wind of the blow. The arrow left the bow. In her sight, she watched it, black and sure, slicing toward Ronan's back. She slammed into him. Her smaller body hit his side hard enough to knock him sideways. The breath whooshed out of him in a grunt of surprise. They went down together, snow biting through her dress. The arrow hissed past where his heart had been, close enough that she felt the air kiss her cheek. It buried itself in the chest of the enemy Ronan had been turning to engage. The man staggered, eyes wide, then crumpled. For a heartbeat, everything near them stuttered. Battle clanged on at the edges, but here, in this small circle of trampled snow, there was only the king, the seer, and the space where death had just missed. Ronan's hands closed around her arms, hard enough to bruise. He rolled, pinning her under him, ready to break the neck of whoever had tackled him. Recognition hit his face, like another strike. "You!" he breathed, furious, disbelieving, wild around the edges. His eyes burned. "What have you done?" "Saved you," she gasped. Her lungs were empty, her ribs screaming. His weight pressed her into the snow, his heat shockingly vivid through layers. "Alpha!" a voice roared. "Which?" Warriors closed in, forming a ring. Some had blood streaming down their faces. Others were barely scratched. All looked at her like she was the blade that had almost slit their king's throat. "She followed us," one spat. "She's cursed us. She's directing their arrows. Get her away from him." A sword lifted, point angling toward her exposed throat. Ronan moved so fast, she almost didn't see it. He twisted, one hand releasing her to catch the incoming blade with his own. Steel screamed against steel. "Stand down," he snarled, voice like a crack of ice. The warrior held his ground for a heartbeat too long, eyes bright with fear-driven rage. "She's a seer," he spat. "She'll lead us into—" Ronan's blade knocked his aside with a savage twist. "Anyone who touches her dies by my hand," he said, low and deadly. "Do you understand me?" Silence rippled outward. Even the enemies nearest hesitated, sensing the shift in the air. Lyria stared up at him, stunned. Snowflakes clung to his lashes. Blood, not his, spattered his jaw. His weight over her was solid and hot, his heart hammering hard enough that she could feel it through armor. "Alpha, she just saved your king," Ronan snapped. "You think our enemies don't know our stories, our fears? They laid a trap that smelled like prophecy, expected us to flinch at the first seer who moved. I won't dance to their strings." The lie anything but belief burned rough in his voice. He was shaking, she realized, not from cold, from how close the arrow had come. Pain shrieked behind her eyes. The battlefield flickered, this moment overlaid with the one she had seen earlier. Spear, not arrow. Ronan turning too late. "Not yet," she begged the vision. "Not now." It didn't listen. A shout tore across the clearing. An enemy broke through the ring of warriors, lunging at Ronan's exposed side. Lyria saw it a breath before anyone else. Saw the blade aimed not at armor, but at the seam where it parted, at flesh. "Ronan!" She tried to twist, tried to pull him. But his own attention was already jerked toward the movement. He surged up, half turning. The spear drove in. It missed his heart by inches, punching instead below his ribs. The sound it made was sickening, meat and metal and a wet exhale. His body jerked. The breath he'd been drawing left in a shocked grunt. The attacking warrior died a heartbeat later, cut down by 3 blades at once. Ronan staggered. His hand went to his side, came away red. The world narrowed to that colour. Lyria scrambled up as he collapsed to one knee. The warriors around them shifted, some shouting for a shield wall, others for a retreat. Enemy forces were pulling back, their ambush half spent and costly. The fog began to break, revealing bodies strewn like discarded toys. She reached him on a broken sob. "Let me." His eyes, impossibly, found hers first. "Don't," he ground out. Pain carved deep lines into his face. "Not here." He was still trying to protect her reputation, even bleeding into the snow. She ignored him. Her hands pressed to his side, fingers sinking into warmth that gushed too fast. Blood soaked her skin, hot and slick, smelling of iron and something uniquely his. Winter and wolf, and the weight of a kingdom. The vision hit like a hammer. It ripped her sideways, through the moment, through the fog, up above the battlefield. She saw the pattern of bodies, of trees, of movement, and beyond that, the shape of the plan that had led them here. This was no wild ambush. It was too clean, too perfect. She saw the second force appearing behind them, exactly where Ronan's rear guard had been too thin. She saw a signal, faint, almost lost in the chaos. A strip of crimson cloth tied to a branch on their own side of the forest. A flare burned briefly on a hill nearer the fortress than the enemy's lands, calling the hidden army into motion at precisely the right time. Not enemy magic. Someone who knew their route, their numbers, their fear. Betrayal, etched in fire and blood. Lyria choked as the vision spat her back out. She was on her knees in the snow again, hands clamped to Ronan's wound, his blood scalding her palms. His face swam in front of her, blurred by tears she hadn't realized she'd shed. "Lyria," he said, voice ragged. His hand closed weakly over her wrist. "What do you see?" She shook, every nerve aflame. The word tangled in her throat, heavy with horror. "Not an ambush," she whispered. "Someone showed them where to bite. Someone from our side." Her voice broke. The taste of iron filled her mouth. "This was no ambush," she said, the vision's certainty ringing in her bones. "It was betrayal." Lyria woke to stone, and darkness, and pain. Not the sharp kind, the humming, crawling kind that lived under the skin. Her wrists burned. When she lifted them, chains rattled, and dim blue light pulsed beneath her flesh, like embers trapped in bone. A seer's visions trying to surface. But someone had forced them down. Bootsteps scraped across the dungeon floor. She tensed. A torch flared to life, throwing jagged shadows across the walls. Crux crouched in front of her. His face was calm. Too calm. Like a man praying before a sacrifice he'd already decided was holy. "You heal," he said softly, tilting her chin up with one gloved finger. "You warn. You whisper your poison in our king's ear." His voice hardened. "I should have cut your throat the moment Ronan brought you into this fortress." Lyria's pulse thudded like a fist in her throat. "Ronan knows." "Ronan," Crux hissed, "is not what he was. Your presence rots him from the inside." He stood, pacing slowly. "A king who protects a seer? That is no king of wolves. That is a man softened by lies. The torchlight flickered. Chains groaned as she shifted, trying to sit straighter. I didn't lead him into anything, she whispered. I saved him. You interfered. Crux turned, eyes bright as a predator's. Your vision today? That chaos? That was your doing. You led him toward danger to convince him he needs you. That's not true. Oh, it is. He leaned close, breath hot with fury. Prophets always create the horrors they foresee. You make us dependent. You make us weak. You've almost succeeded. Lyria swallowed hard. The walls blurred for a second, not from tears, but from the pressure behind her eyes. A vision clawed for release, but the glow on her wrists pulsed hard, chaining it down. What did you do to me? She whispered. Crux smiled thinly. Suppression irons. Old relics. They choke visions in your blood. He glanced at her trembling hands. If one tries to surface, it burns you alive from the inside. Her breath hitched. The blue glow flared, stabbing pain up her arms. Crux watched, fascinated. See? Your curse fights the chains. You're trembling, dying to warn again. Pathetic. He straightened and drew a long dagger, obsidian black, wickedly curved. Lyria froze. This, he said, lifting the blade, is how we restore order. One death. His gaze hardened. One message. He meant to kill her. Before dawn, before Ronan realized she'd been taken. A cold shiver crawled through her spine. A vision suddenly punched through the irons. A violent burst so strong it nearly ripped a scream from her throat. She saw Ronan, collapsing, blood on his lips. A shadow behind him. Crux? No. Someone else. A threat she couldn't name. Ronan reaching out, searching for something in the dark. Her. Then darkness swallowing. Him whole. Lyria gasped, body arching as the irons tried to smother the vision. Blue fire shot through her wrists. She bit her lips until blood ran down her chin. Crux grabbed her face, wrenching her still. What did you see? She couldn't speak. Her body shook violently, chains clanging against stone. What? Crux repeated quietly. Did you see? That he dies, she rasped, barely able to get the air out. If I don't reach him. Crux went still. Then he laughed. Perfect. The king dies, weakened by the witch he defended. The old laws live again. He turned the dagger in his hand, the blade catching blue light from her wrists. Lyria twisted against the chains, panic flaring hot in her lungs. Stop, please, don't beg, he said. It makes it worse. He drew the blade back, and the dungeon door exploded. Stone shattered, dust billowed, Crux spun, snarling, dagger raised. Ronan stood framed in the doorway, chest heaving, hair matted with dried blood. His eyes glowed molten gold, not shifted, but close, too close. He was bleeding from the ribs where the spear had struck him. The wound was bound, but soaked through. His breath rasped. He should not have been walking, but he was. He stepped into the dungeon like judgment incarnate. Release her, Ronan said, voice so low it reverberated through the walls. Crux didn't move. You're wounded, my king, Crux said softly, barely standing, and she is the reason for it. Let me end this. Let me save you. Ronan's eyes narrowed. You kidnapped her, he said, dragged her into the dark, and dared to call it loyalty. Crux's jaw clenched. Loyalty to the laws, to the wolves you've forgotten, to the ones you let die following prophecy last time. His voice cracked with conviction. I'm saving the pack from you. Ronan moved, too fast for any wounded man. Their blades clashed, obsidian against steel. Sparks spat across the floor. Crux blocked the first strike, parried the second, dodged the third. Ronan was stronger. But Crux was ruthless, trained in the old kill-fast style. And Ronan's wounds slowed him. Crux feinted left, then drove the obsidian dagger toward Ronan's side. Lyria screamed. The blade pierced Ronan just under the ribs. A second wound, deeper than the first. Ronan's body jerked. He staggered. Crux twisted the blade, pushing it deeper. "This," he whispered, "is how we purge corruption." Ronan's growl filled the dungeon, low, inhuman, vibrating the stone. He didn't fall. Instead, he slammed his head into Crux's face. Bone cracked. Crux reeled. Ronan ripped the dagger free with a snarl, blood pouring down his side, and drove it straight into Crux's heart. The war general gasped, eyes widening, his knees buckled. He fell, dead. Ronan stood over him, chest heaving, breath ragged, blood darkening the stone beneath him. Then he swayed and collapsed to his knees. "Ronan!" Lyria yanked at her chains until they cut her wrists. "Ronan!" He lifted his head just enough to look at her. It was the first time he'd ever looked afraid. "Lyria?" His voice was barely a breath. "I didn't." "No," he turned. His hand pressed to his side. Blood leaked through his fingers. Too much. Too fast. Lyria lunged forward, the iron searing her skin, and grabbed him as he sagged sideways. His weight collapsed into her arms, heavy, feverish. "Stay with me," she whispered, shaking. "Please stay." His head dropped against her shoulder. "Don't." His breath rattled. "Leave." His heartbeat fluttered weakly, then stuttered, stopped. "No, no." Lyria's breath hitched. Her hands glowed faintly as the irons pulsed, fighting her power. Pain ripped up her arms, white-hot. Her vision blurred. She pressed her palms harder to his wound. "Please," she begged, voice breaking. "Please." Ronan lay limp in her lap, blood soaking her dress, eyes sliding half shut. The heartbeat she needed to feel, the heartbeat she had to fix, was fading. And Lyria realized, with a sick, crushing certainty, as tears mixed with Ronan's blood, she might not be strong enough to save him. She dragged him through the fortress with his blood on her hands. Ronan's body was heavier than anything she'd ever carried. Armor and muscle and crownless weight. His boots bumped against the stone with every desperate backward step she took. His cloak trailing like a dark pool behind them. "Move!" she hissed at herself more than at the world. "Just move!" His heartbeat thudded against her palms in a stumbling, uneven rhythm. Whenever it faltered, she tightened her grip around his ribs, forcing more of her warmth into him, refusing to let that weak flutter collapse into silence. The dungeon corridor opened into the lower hall. Warriors skidded to a halt at the sight of them. King limp, Seer hauling him, blood smeared along the floor like a trail. "Alpha! Moon, save us! Get him away from her!" They surged forward as one. Lyria spun, teeth bared, breath tearing in her chest. "Don't touch him," she rasped. "If you break the contact, he dies." They froze. Maybe it was the way she said it. Maybe it was the way the collar at her throat glowed faintly now. Runes flickering like cooling metal. Suppression irons overtaxed and cracking. The air around her felt thin, stretched. The vision ache in her bones throbbed with every step. "She's killing him." "She's the only thing keeping him standing," snarled another voice. Rowan, the scarred soldier, who had held her chain that first day, shouldered through the crowd. His eyes took in the scene. Crux's blood still dark on her dress. Ronan's pallor, the way Lyria shook and clung. For a heartbeat, his face went blank with shock. Then he moved. "Out of the way!" he barked, Clear a path to the Alpha's chambers. Now. But move, or I start cutting. Wolves obeyed the voice that sounded most like survival. The corridor opened again. Lyria stumbled through it, dragging Ronan backward. His chest pressed to her front so she could feel each fragile beat. His skin burned. His breath rattled hot against her temple when his head lolled forward. Poison was a different heat than blood loss. She could feel it already, a sour, creeping burn along his veins. "Hold on," she whispered to him, though she didn't know if he could hear. "You held me here. Hold a little longer." They reached his door at last. Someone threw it open. Firelight spilled out, warm and bright and far too gentle for this moment. Lyria all but fell inside. "Out!" Rowan snapped at the others. "No one comes in unless I say." Protests rose, died at the look in his eyes. He slammed the door. The heavy bar dropped into place, with a finality that made the room feel like a sealed wound. Silence settled under the crackling fire, and Ronan's ragged breaths. Lyria let him slide onto the bed as carefully as she could manage, collapsing with him so her hands never left his side. The blankets darkened beneath them. The metallic scent of blood filled her lungs. She didn't have time to be afraid. She tore at the bindings around his wound, ripping fabric apart with shaking fingers. The puncture gaped beneath, dark, ugly, edges already discolored by whatever poison crux had coated that blade with. Her visions flared like a storm. She saw his heart shuddering, slowing. She saw venom crawling along pathways of blood like slick, black vines. She saw two futures, one where she hesitated, and those vines reached his heart. One where she broke herself against them, and maybe, just maybe, held them back. The choice did not feel like a choice at all. "Ronan," she whispered, more prayer than address. "You're not allowed to die before you see what you've built." She pressed her hands to his side. The pain that hit her swallowed the world. It came like molten metal poured through her veins. Every nerve screamed. The suppression irons on her wrists flared white hot, trying to choke the flood of power that burst from her, then cracked with a sound like ice breaking on a river. The glowing bands around her bones shattered, fragments of old magic searing bright, and then fading into nothing. Her visions were unbound. They surged through her in a rushing torrent, bringing 1,000 half-seen futures to her tongue. Wolves howling, halls burning, children laughing, blood on snow, a hand in hers in the dark. She bit down on all of it and focused on one thing: the poison in his body. She saw it as threads of darkness pulsing with each weak heartbeat. She wrapped herself around them, drew them toward her hands, forced them to change direction. It felt like dragging claws across the inside of her bones. She did not know how long she knelt there. Time dissolved into heat and breath, and the rhythm of the man beneath her hands. Her own heart picked up his stutter every time it faltered, staggering in sympathy. She poured herself into him until her fingers went numb and her lips turned cold. At some point, a voice cut through the haze. "Rhea." It sounded like wind under a door, like gravel dragged across stone, like a man too tired to keep his armor on his words. She blinked. Ronan's eyes were open, not fully, not with their usual hard clarity, but enough. Their color had dimmed to a softer storm, clouded, pained, but there. "Stop," he murmured. "You'll tear yourself apart." She swallowed, throat raw. "You're not finished." "Lyria." His hand lifted, trembled, and cupped the back of her neck. His palm was hot. His thumb found the small place under her ear, where her pulse thundered. Enough! She hadn't known how desperate she was until that moment, until his voice anchored her to herself again. Tears she hadn't noticed collecting spilled over. Her hands stilled against his skin, still tingling with the remnants of magic and venom. If I stop, her voice broke. If I stop, your heart is still beating, he said. Because of you. He drew a careful breath, winced as it stretched his healing ribs, but it was a breath that didn't rattle the same way anymore. The angry heat under her palms had cooled, the edges of the wound knitting even as she watched. There will be scars, she whispered, half to herself. Inside, it won't be like before. Good. His mouth moved, a ghost of the bitter smile she'd come to recognize, but softer now. Maybe they'll remember who I owe my life to. You don't owe. Yes. His fingers tightened slightly at her nape, enough to cut her off without force. His gaze sharpened, clearing. I owe you. She realized then how close they were. She was bent over him, straddling the edge of the mattress, his body half in her lap from where she'd dragged him. Firelight painted his bare chest in gold and shadow. Her bloodied hands rested just above the line of it, where his heartbeat thudded against her touch. The room smelled of smoke and iron and him. His breath warmed her face. The king's mask was gone. In its place was a man who had walked into death twice in one day, and found the same seer between him and the void both times. I was afraid, he said suddenly. The admission startled her more than any shout. He swallowed, eyes flicking past her briefly, toward the ceiling, as if he couldn't quite bear to look at her while he laid his own bones bare. After the valley, he murmured, after we buried them, I decided fear was weakness. I killed it. Or thought I had. I made myself stone. Wolves needed something that didn't bend. His hand slipped from her neck to her shoulder, fingers curling there as if to anchor himself. Then they brought you to that block, he went on, and I saw not a weapon, not an omen, just a woman who looked like she'd been carrying other people's deaths alone for too long. Heat crept up Lyria's throat. She had no words for that. No one had ever said they'd seen her, only what she could do. So I bought you, he said, voice roughening, and told myself it was strategy, that I could use you, that I would never listen to you. He huffed a sound that might have been a laugh if it wasn't so frayed. His eyes came back to hers. Every time you spoke, I heard that valley. Every time you touched someone, I saw my brother's blood. I hated what you were. I thought if I pushed hard enough, I could make you small. Safe. His jaw clenched. But you stepped into the yard anyway. You threw yourself into the path of a death meant for me. Twice. His thumb brushed absently against her collarbone, as if he'd forgotten his hand was there. You terrified me, he finished, barely audible. Not because of your visions, because I started wanting you to live more than I wanted never to be wrong again. Her chest ached. Slowly, she curled her fingers against his skin, needing something to hold. Onto that wasn't pain. You were never stone, she whispered. Just hurt. Stone doesn't bleed. Lyria, you think I don't know fear? Her voice shook, but she pushed through it. I was dragged from village to village, blamed for every death I couldn't stop, every death I could. My visions were always endings, fires, graves, the worst thing that could happen, over and over, from the moment I closed my eyes to the moment I opened them. She drew a breath, felt his heartbeat under her palm. But since I came here, she hesitated, searching for the shape of it. They changed. His brows knit. Changed how? Her lips trembled into a small, disbelieving smile. I saw you dying. Yes. Ambushed. Betrayed. But after that, I saw something else. Flickers. Moments that made no sense. You in this hall, laughing. Wolves laying their weapons down and listening. A boy you saved teaching his pup to fight kinder. Me, she swallowed. Me standing beside you, not behind. Hope tasted strange on her tongue. New, fragile. For the first time, she said, my visions didn't stop at the grave. They went past it, past the worst part, and you were always there. Her gaze held his. You did that. Your choices did. You changed the path. You changed them. Silence stretched, heavy with breath and heartbeat and fire crackle. He looked at her like she'd said something sacred. Not seer, not curse, just Lyria. I don't know how to want what you're offering, he said after a moment, voice low. A future I can't control, a hope that isn't paid for in advance with blood. It feels dangerous. Everything worth keeping is, she murmured. A faint, exhausted huff escaped him. You would argue with a dying man. You're not dying, she whispered. Not while I'm in this room. Something in his chest loosened. She felt it under her hand, a subtle easing, as if some band he'd wrapped around himself had been cut. His fingers slid up, over her shoulder, along the line of her neck, until his hand cradled her jaw. Lyria, he said again. Just her name, but it felt like more. She held still. The air between them tightened. She could feel his breath on her lips now, feel the way his body pulled toward hers, even as pain tethered him. I will never kneel to a prophecy again, he murmured. But I can choose you. Her heart stuttered. Not as a tool, he went on. Not as a weapon I point at the dark. As the only person in this cursed fortress who tells me the truth, even when I don't want to hear it. As the one who drags me through my own blood, instead of letting me lie down in it. His thumb brushed the corner of her mouth, slow, reverent. As my equal, he said softly, if you'll have me. The world narrowed to the warmth of his hand, the rasp of his voice, the wild flutter of her own pulse. Yes, she breathed. It wasn't a decision. It was a recognition. His gaze dropped briefly to her mouth. Then forgive me, he whispered, for wanting this earlier than I should. He closed the last sliver of distance. The first touch of his lips was almost nothing. Soft, hesitant, a question. Heat flared through her anyway, swift and overwhelming. All the fear, all the pain, all the hours of holding him to life recoiled and came back as a different kind of ache. She answered. Her hand slid from his chest to his shoulder, fingers digging in as she leaned into him, into the kiss that was still careful, still restrained despite the storm under it. His mouth parted on a quiet, rough sound that vibrated against hers. For a moment, time stepped aside. There was no prophecy, no pact, no old laws, just the taste of him. Iron and winter and something unexpectedly sweet, and the strange, fierce tenderness of a man who had forgotten how to be gentle with anything, but held the seer like she was both breakable and the only unbreakable thing he'd ever found. When they finally drew apart, breath mingling in the narrow space between them, her head spun. He rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed, as if the contact was the only thing keeping him anchored. You are not my seer, he said, voice raw. You are not my property. You are Lyria, and if I stand before my pack again, it will be with you at my side. Or not at all. A low murmur drifted in from beyond the thick wood of the door. The pack, waiting. Rows of wolves who didn't know if their king lived or if their world had cracked in half. Men who had followed Crux, who had seen her hands buried in Ronan's wound. Fear, anger, hope, all pressed against the threshold like a physical weight. She tensed. They're afraid, she whispered, of what they think I am, of what they don't understand. Good, he said quietly. That means they're awake. He shifted, gritting his teeth as he pushed himself upright. She moved with him at once, bracing his back, her shoulder under his arm, ready to take as much of his weight as he would allow. You shouldn't. I should, he cut in. If I hide, they'll fill the shadows with old ghosts. Crux's voice will live longer than his body. He turned his head, meeting her gaze. If I bleed, they need to see who stands with me when I do. His arm slid more securely around her shoulders. He was still weak, still healing, but there was a steadiness in him now that hadn't been there when she dragged him up from the dungeon floor. He nodded toward the door. Unbar it, he said. Let them see us. Her hand shook only a little as she lifted the heavy wooden bar. The murmur outside hushed at the scrape. She drew a breath that felt like stepping onto new ground, met Ronan's eyes one last time, and pulled the door open. They stood together in the doorway, king and seer, wolf and witch, scars and blood, and the faint, stubborn light of something new, and faced the waiting pack. Spring changed the fortress more than any war ever had. Where silence once sat heavy in the courtyards, laughter now threaded through the air. Thin at first, then bolder, like new grass pushing up through frost. Snowmelt ran in small, chattering rivers along the stone paths. The training dummies still stood, but their splintered wood was ringed with early flowers, green daring to brush against old bloodstains. Lyria stood at one of the arrow-slit windows of Ronan's study, fingers pressed to the warm stone. The wind that slipped in no longer cut like knives. It carried damp earth, smoke from cooking fires, the distant yip of pups wrestling where once only the crack of stern commands had echoed. Her visions didn't fight her anymore. They moved quietly beneath her skin, like a river content in its bed, surfacing only when called, or when something important shifted. Today, they hummed with a warm, anticipatory buzz that made her feel as if she'd swallowed starlight. Behind her, someone cleared their throat pointedly. You're meant to be outside, Rowan said, not hiding with the scrolls like a monk. Lyria turned. Rowan leaned against the doorframe, scars softened by the new lightness in his face. He still wore his leathers and weapons, but there was a sprig of green braided into his shoulder strap, a child's doing by the clumsiness of it. I'm not hiding, she said, though her heart had been grateful for the quiet a moment ago. I'm gathering myself, he snorted. You faced down Crux, half the pack, and 3 different death visions. I doubt a ceremony scares you. It's not the ceremony, she admitted. Her fingers brushed the thin silver band at her throat, the new collar crafted by the pack's smiths. Not iron, not a chain. A simple circle etched with runes of protection and choice. She had put it on herself. It's what it means, Rowan said, gentler. For them, for him, for you. Lyria smiled faintly. You understand more than you pretend to. Don't spread that rumor. He straightened, pushing off the frame. They're waiting, and he's pacing by the gate like a caged wolf. You know he only does that when you're not where he can see you. Warmth flared in her chest. "I'll come," she said. Rowan inclined his head and left her alone again. She drew in one last, steadying breath and turned back to the window. Below, the main courtyard had been swept clean. Torches bracketed the walls despite the lingering daylight, waiting for the moon's rise. The pack gathered in a wide ring, warriors in their leathers, elders with their cloaks pinned and straight, children weaving between legs until their parents caught them with admonishing hands and hidden smiles. In one corner, a group of healers stood together, their hands marked not by scars of battle, but by ink and salves. Some had once hidden their talents, others had never dared cultivate them. Now, they wore their role openly. She could see the new law etched in their posture. Ronan had read it aloud himself in this very hall weeks ago, his voice echoing off stone. No seer, healer, or bearer of prophetic blood shall be harmed, hunted, chained, or used as weapon against their will. Their counsel is to be heard, not obeyed without question. Their lives are to be guarded as fiercely as any warrior's. The old men had muttered. Some had protested. Crux's absence was a shadow in their midst for a time. But then the boy whose neck she had healed, Taryn, had stood, head high despite the old shame, and said in a loud, clear voice, "If you forbid them, you forbid me. I would be dead in the snow without her." Others had followed. Change never came all at once. It came like spring, thaw by thaw, drip by drip, until one day the ground was soft, and no one could say exactly when the frost had finally left. "Lyria," his voice wrapped around her from the doorway, warm and rough and familiar. She turned. Ronan stood there in formal leathers she'd never seen him wear before. Dark, almost black, fitted close, the wolf's head clasp at his shoulder polished to a soft sheen. His scars were uncovered, unhidden, the line at his temple catching the light. The silver of his crown was simple, a circlet, nothing more. But it changed the way the firelight framed him. He moved toward her, and the room felt smaller, the world narrowing the way it always did when his attention fell entirely on her. "You look like you're considering jumping from the window," he said. She glanced at the narrow slit. "It's a long way down." "You'd see it before you hit," he said dryly, "and I'd prefer not to test how accurate you are with your own death." She smiled, tension loosening in her shoulders. "No jumping then." He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. His eyes traced her face, then dropped briefly to the dress the pack's women had helped her into. Deep blue, flowing, the fabric catching whispers of light when she moved. It left her collar bare, the new silver band gleaming against her skin. "You're beautiful," he said simply. Heat rose to her cheeks. She had heard men flatter and mutter pretty words in taverns and villages. But this landed different. There was no hunger in it, only awe, as if he still couldn't quite believe she was real. "You're bleeding through your sleeve," she counted, catching the faint darkening stain near his bicep. He huffed. "You pick now to point that out? You pick now to reopen an injury. Only a little." He flexed his hand, testing the arm. "You know you've ruined me, don't you?" "How so?" "I used to think strength meant never showing pain," he said. "Now, I have a queen-to-be who sighs at me if I pretend I don't feel an arrow." "Queen?" The word trembled through her, startling and sweet. He did not often use it aloud, though the whispers had spread already. Seer, mate, queen. "Did you think the ceremony was just for show?" he asked quietly. We're wolves. Claiming isn't a word we use lightly. Not anymore. Her heart tripped. He reached for her hand, his fingers dwarfing hers, rough tips brushing the faint scars on her palms. Are you ready? Her mind flickered, unbidden, to all that had led them here. Auction blocks and iron collars, winter courtyards and blood-slick snow. Crux's eyes as he fell, Ronan's heartbeat stuttering under her hands, her own terror and stubbornness and the strange, fierce tenderness that had grown between them, like fire, taking root in cold stone. She looked up at him. Yes, she said, I am. They walked together down the narrow stair, hand in hand. As they stepped into the open air, a hush rippled through the courtyard. The moon had already risen, pale disk climbing the evening sky, not yet full but generous with its light. It washed over stone and fur and flesh, painting every face in silver blue. Ronan stopped at the center of the ring. Lyria stood at his left side. The pack watched. Some eyes held skepticism, some fear, some open curiosity. There were those who still wore their old laws like armor. But there were others, many others, who had lost friends in the ambush, who had seen their king bleed, who had seen the seer's hands pulling him back from the edge. Ronan's voice carried easily when he spoke. You remember what I was, he said. No preamble, no soft entry. You remember what I made you into. A murmur, shoulders shifted, heads bowed slightly, remembering. A pack that did not flinch, he went on. A fortress of stone, no weakness, no softness, no seers, no healers beyond what our own hands could do. His gaze turned briefly toward the cluster of healers. One of them, an older woman with lines around her eyes deeper than his, lifted her chin. I built that because I was afraid, he said. I told you it was strength. It was not. It was grief with armor on. Lyria felt the words move through the crowd like wind. I trusted a seer once, he said. It cost us half our pack. I swore never to bow to visions again. Then Lyria came. His fingers tightened slightly on hers. Eyes turned to her. She held steady. She told me truths I didn't want, he said. Not just about battle, about myself, about how hard we had become, not strong, how we punished pain instead of mending it, how we worshipped scars more than the wolves who carried them. A low sound, almost agreement, moved at the edges. When I bled, he said, she did not leave me in the snow. She did not say, if he is weak, let him die. She dragged me through my own blood and held my heart in her hands until it remembered how to beat. His voice roughened at the memory. Lyria's own chest tightened. Loving her has not made me weaker, he said, and there was iron in that declaration. It has made me accountable, to myself, to you, to the future I started to see when her visions stopped ending in graves. He turned fully toward her then, so the pack saw his profile and her face together. Lyria, he said quietly, but loud enough that every wolf could hear. You are not my omen. You are not my chained weapon. You are my mate, my equal. The seer who sees farther than I can, and the woman whose heart has become the measure of my strength. He sank to one knee. The courtyard drew in a sharp breath. Alphas did not kneel, not even in jest. Lyria's vision blurred. For a heartbeat, the real world overlaid with something else. Ronan knee-deep in snow, bodies around him, falling to his knees in despair. This time, he knelt in choice. Before the moon and the pack, he said, head bowed, I bind my life to yours, not in chains, in choice. If my path strays toward fear, pull me back. if yours is shadowed by visions, I will stand in them with you. I will not hide you. I will not silence you. I will not let anyone raise a hand to you and call it loyalty to me. His eyes lifted to hers. Will you stand with me? He asked. Not behind? With? Her throat was too tight to speak at first. Images flooded her, a flicker of vision, triggered not by fear, but by the sheer weight of the moment. She saw herself walking battle lines with him, whispering warnings of storms, sitting at long tables with maps spread between them, teaching children to listen not just to the roar of their wolf, but to the whisper of their own pain. She saw wolves laying down old grudges like weapons, saw healers moving freely through the courtyard, saw elders telling stories in which seers were not curses, but crossroads. She saw herself older, lines at the corners of her mouth from laughter rather than grimness. Lyria let the images settle. Yes, she said, voice shaking but clear. I will stand with you. She sank to her knees in front of him, not in subservience, but to meet him eye to eye. Her hands rose, cupping his face, scar and all. The pack leaned forward as one. Under the moon's pale light, she bent and pressed her forehead to his. The air shifted. Wolves felt bonds in their bones. The moment she let her power brush his, gently, not to heal, but to join. A soft, instinctive sound went through the crowd. Half sigh, half growl. A new tether formed, neither leash nor chain. A tie of shared futures. He kissed her then, not like the first time in the quiet of his chamber, but openly, briefly, with a reverence that rolled through the pack like thunder. When they rose, hand in hand, no one spoke for a long moment. Then slowly, a sound began. One wolf lifted his head and howled, not in mourning, but in something wilder, freer. Another joined, then another. Voices rose, braiding together, filling the spring-warmed air with a new kind of song. Lyria's chest swelled. Ronan turned to face them, her fingers laced with his. This is our law now, he called. Strength and mercy, fang and hand. We will still fight. We will still bleed. But we will not worship a pain for its own sake. We will not throw away those who can see the cliff before we run off it. We will not fear love more than death. The howl peaked, broke, softened into scattered cheers and murmurs. Somewhere, a child laughed, high and bright. Later, when the fires burned low and the moon climbed higher, when the pack drifted back to their dens and the air held the tired contentment of a day well spent, Lyria lay beside Ronan in the quiet of their chamber. The fortress no longer felt like a cage. His arm was beneath her head, his hand resting lightly on her hip. His breathing had settled into a steady rhythm, warm against her hair. Are you seeing? He murmured into the dark. She blinked. She hadn't realized her gaze had gone distant. Yes, she whispered, but it's different. Show me. His fingers traced idle circles against her side. Or tell me, at least. She let the vision rise, open, gentle as spring. She saw Ronan older. The scar at his temple softened into something part of him, not all of him. His hair threaded with silver, laughter lines at the corners of his eyes. Children darted around his feet. 3 of them, maybe 4, all different combinations of dark hair and bright eyes. One tugged on his cloak, demanding his attention. Another practiced a clumsy fighting stance that made Lyria's heart ache with fondness. A smaller one climbed into his lap with a book far too big for their hands. Lyria saw herself across the room, watching them all, her hands ink-stained and sure as she rolled up a map. The air was full of noise, bickering, giggles, the low rumble of Ronan's amused chiding. Fear was there still, but quieter. A companion, not a master. Love was louder. She smiled into the pillow. "What is it?" he asked, voice sleepy. "You," she said. "Us, children. A hall full of noise you pretend to hate and secretly love." He huffed against her hair. "Sounds exhausting." "It looks—" Her chest tightened with something too big for words. "Good. It looks like a future built on something other than surviving the next winter." He was quiet for a beat. She felt him shift to look down at her, even in the dark. "And do I still pace when you're out of my sight?" he asked. "Yes," she said, amused. "But less?" "Then I can live with it." She turned in his arms, laying a hand over his heart. It beat steady beneath her palm, strong, sure, tethered to hers in a way no prophecy could have predicted. Her visions had always ended in death. Now, as sleep pulled at her, the last image that stayed with her was of Ronan's older face, bent over a child who had his stubborn jaw, and her thoughtful eyes, both of them smiling in a light that had nothing to do with fire or moon. For the first time in her life, Lyria closed her eyes on a future not shaped by fear, but by the quiet, enduring miracle of love that had chosen to stay and to build. Thank you for listening. If this story found a place in you, come back when your heart wants another. With love, Claire,